Welcome to the show about people changing the world. This show was created specifically for people like Mark Griffith. Mark Griffith had a terrific rugby amateur career, 9 caps for the USA Eagles. Mark also had a very promising investment banking career. But in 2003, Mark started up Play Rugby USA, what would become Play Rugby USA, to work with homeless kids out of Brooklyn. A few years later, his investment banking career, when he's faced with the prospects of getting a promotion, working on Wall Street, being financially successful his entire life, he made the decision to go and change the world. Working full-time with Play Rugby USA. Play Rugby USA now is in all 5 boroughs of New York City. It's in Los Angeles. It's in San Francisco. It has been designated a U.S. Olympic Development Group by the U.S. Olympic Committee. Multiple awards, but most importantly, working with low-income, at-risk kids, where you have a 40 to 50% dropout rate in some areas. Mark's group out of Play Rugby USA Academy has 100% high school graduation and 100% of kids going to either college or trade school. An absolute pioneer in sports-based youth development. Mark Griffith, changing the world. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. You got the job. Thank you for that. Very warm welcome.
I want to get to the origins in a second, but I want to get right to that moment where you're standing there with your toes in the edge of the Rubicon, and you just get a promotion offer. I guess it's from Royal Bank of Scotland and investment bank. You're about to be financially set for life, and you make the worst financial decision that you could possibly make, and leave that and go to do something that's great for the world and start up Play Rugby USA full time. Tell me about that decision.
Yeah, that was at the time. It was probably the most stressful week of my life. I think. I can justify it because math was my worst subject at school. So I was always in the back of my mind, like, why am I in the bank? Why am I in the bank? I loved the people I worked with. I enjoyed my job, but I wasn't super passionate about it. I did it, and I enjoyed the people, and it was just because of the experience I'd had a year before, when I did get to play for the USA team and play against England. It was this big aha moment that inspired me to connect the dots back to the opportunities I'd been given as a kid, and was the motivation for setting up Play Rugby USA. And so we'd been 2.5 years into just sort of running weekend programs and things, and I could see the impact it was having. But I also knew that we were relying on organizations to bring the kids to us, and it was never going to scale, and we were never going to reach a load of kids unless we could take the game to them. And the only way I could see to do that was just to spend more time on it and really push that kind of positive energy into the school system and try to prove that rugby could be this amazing vehicle for the kids. So I definitely had this real passion and this burning desire to grow the charity. But, as you said, I just got promoted, and I just got to the point where I was going to start having proper responsibility and start earning proper income, not crazy big income, but comfortable income. And then I went into my boss about a week after the promotion and said, look, thanks very much, but I really want to do this. And we tried to negotiate whether there was a part-time kind of thing, but part-time in banking was 4 days a week, which actually wouldn't have been 4 days a week. And I was like, you know what, that's not going to be enough. 1 day a week, which won't actually be 1 day a week to grow this thing. So I'm just going to take the deep dive. And at the time, my wife at the time, had just been promoted as well, and she was doing decently well. And so there was just the two of us, and it was that we had enough to cover the bills. We didn't really need much more, and it was worth taking a risk for what I thought might be a couple of years. And then you fast forward a few more.
And when you left, did you have any salary that was waiting for you at Play Rugby USA, or did you have any funding coming in at all? I guess you had a little funding coming in for weekend programs, but not enough to support yourself, right?
Oh yeah, no. I think we'd saved up about, at that point, probably $30,000 from weekend programs that we'd run for a couple of years, which were always split between people I knew from the banking community bringing their kids who paid something for the season, between donors who knew what we were up to and supported by donating some money to support the program, and then enabled us the opportunity to provide free programming to the young people coming from the homeless shelters from Brooklyn and from the Bronx at the time, 3 different organizations. So that was the money we had in the bank. We used some of it for some equipment and some kit for the kids and everything. And then a few months later, I found somebody else to come and work in the program, and it paid enough for them to have basically a small salary for a year. But yeah, it took a few years till I was able to draw some money out directly myself. Yeah,
a few years. It took you a few years before you were able to take any financial backing for yourself.
Yeah, I think I was on a bit of a quarter
Did you
salary.
ever have doubt? Did you ever just think, man, I'm not sure I did the right thing here?
I think everybody always has doubt. It's just a question of whether there's enough and whether you still believe more in the end goal, that you don't follow the doubt, right? You just don't act on it. And I think having a little bit of doubt, a little bit of fear is probably a good thing. Not if it's the core driver, but just having it there in the background when there's something you really believe in as well. It just gives you a little bit of a nudge as well as that thing pulling you forward. And so, yeah, no, it was, there was never enough to stop. And certainly not at that time, because I could see the progress. I mean, we were growing quite quickly. I mean, even just financially, I think it was like $30,000, $56,000, and then we went to 175, and then we went to 300 and something, and then we went to 600 and something. And that was representative primarily of the number of schools and kids we were serving, because we were getting grants and some funding from the school system, actually, which was the core funding at the time, to cover the cost of the kids for the program. So we could provide the programs to the kids for free, but charge the schools for the services. So it actually grew really well. Yeah, I think it was 2009 when I got some sort of salary. And at the time, I also worked for USA Rugby for a couple of years to help them grow their youth and high school infrastructure across the country. So I had 2, if you like, half-time rugby roles for a couple of years, which was at the time where USA Rugby was really growing in the youth space and Play Rugby was really growing in the youth space. And so at the end of those 2 years, I had to jump right back into Play Rugby because I couldn't do both. And at that point is when I actually started to get a salary. Yeah.
How did you get the grants? Was that a hard process to go through? What did you go through to get those grants? And you said that was most of your funding to start with, right?
Actually, most of the funding to start with was what we called program revenue, which was through contracts with the schools and through the school system, which for us was at the city level, New York City. The grants did not really come of any material subsequence until 2009. And 2009 is when we got our first big grant at the state level, and then the next year we got another one. So to answer your question, how do we get the grants? I think it's sort of like anything, whether you're in a for-profit business or you're in the service business or whatever you're doing, you're trying to look at in the non-profit space, especially stakeholders, and you have to deliver and prove that you can deliver a service to those stakeholders. So if New York State Department of Education is one of the stakeholders, you can look at what some of the grants are that they provide and see if there's anything there that you genuinely think you can actually do. Now, there was 2 things that stood out for us. One was academic improvement and another was violence prevention. And we applied for grants for both of those. And so you'd be like, well, in a sports program, how do you run a sports program that helps kids do better academically? People could probably understand how it would help with violence prevention, at least the people that understand how rugby works, how it works properly. But you start with those desired outcomes and you work back, and you just have to demonstrate in words, obviously, by clearly answering the questions. It takes you back to school. Just answer the question fully. Demonstrate how you're going to help achieve those outcomes. And so we, at the time, didn't have many metrics. We didn't have tons of data, but we had some really good testimonials. We had some school advocates, and I mean like principals of schools and directors of school programs that just absolutely loved the program, which helped us pull some information from their programs and connect the dots between the values that we were teaching the behaviors that those values were promoting, and then how that was helping those young people do better over a number of different things. But one of those things was academic self-efficacy. And another thing was just all of the different things that helped measure violence prevention, which is, as much as anything, is actually attendance, and then obviously getting the young people engaged in things that they enjoy, giving them a role and a voice in the program design, and then just basically just keeping them busy and teaching them positive values, and then they end up supporting each other and becoming a positive community as opposed to maybe an alternative. So we wrote those grants, we got them, and they're like, just like most things, like setting up a new business that I'm doing now, now we've got to prove it. And so those grants really enabled us to prove it at some scale. Actually, it doubled the size of the organization one year and doubled the size of the organization again, which had its own stresses and strains, but it was very, very positive.
For those out there that are watching this or listening to this, sports-based youth development, they may have programs. You mentioned in the schools themselves, you were funded by some of the schools, but to put sports into that school. How much was the funding, for example? And was that a hard process to go through? Because a lot of people are not aware that some schools will fund a program to come in and put a plug-and-play system in place.
Yes, it was quite a long process to go through in New York City. New York City is the biggest school district in the country, and so I believe it was a 90-something page or 138 page. I mean, it's a massive file. The application that we had to go through to get that contract. But every school does. I can't speak for every school district. I would imagine most school districts have some form of central funding for organisations to apply for, and or a process that can be replicated with different schools where they can apply directly to schools. New York City is a bit of a hybrid in that you apply to be a contracted vendor with the city, which is the massive document, and it literally took, I think, 18 months or something to go through that process. Once we were approved, essentially it put us into a database. So what that meant was a school principal or anybody that had some form of discretion with the school budget could find us as a vendor, as a contracted vendor, in the sectors that we were focused on, which was after school programming, youth development, physical activity, I think were the three things. And then they could select us, but then the school still had to pay us. So all it was a kind of a formal permission to do business with us that made it much more efficient for a school to do business with us. And then it came down to a conversation about, obviously, how many kids we were going to serve, how frequently we were going to be in the school, how many staff we were going to be providing from our organisation to work with them, what space they had, so on and so forth, and then balance that off against the budget and the things they were looking for us to deliver. And then that was kind of the negotiation that we had. So I don't know what that looks like in other school districts, but most school districts, and the other area to look at is how after school programs are run. So we chose to work in the after school system more than during the school day, because in the after school system, in a sports-based youth development model where it's critical that you can develop relationships, what we call vital connections with the young people on a regular basis over time and have them work together as a group, it's easier to do that in an after-school setting where there's some form of structure because they come to rugby on a Tuesday and a Thursday, for example. But after-school programs and the systems that fund them are different. School district by school district, there's state funding usually. There's usually some city funding, but then there's often lots of private organisations that run those programs. So the solutions will be different. The core success for everybody is being able to demonstrate that your program can achieve the outcomes that those organisations want to achieve. So all of those organisations want the young people there more often. They want the young people to be behaving well, to be interacting well together. They want the young people to be more confident in their academic ability. They want the young people to be able to communicate more effectively. There's a number of metrics, probably around social emotional learning, that the principals and our school program directors want to do exactly what you want to do. And it's just your vehicle for doing it through a sport is different than it would be through the classroom.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that, how to measure success, because that's very important, for that, for the social impact bonds, as Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, has been so big in backing. What was the average funding for the school like that for a program? Do you remember the dollar amount?
Yeah, I think that the sort of probably the smallest program we would run would have been about $1,500 for a season, for 10 weeks. And that would be us in the school, probably once a week, and then supporting the young people from that school coming to 3 tournaments at the end of that season. And that included their equipment and everything else as well. So that was probably one of the, if you like, least expensive programs. And it was honestly the minimal amount of programming we were willing to provide, because 2 days a week is much more effective for developing those social emotional learning outcomes over one season. So for most of our programs were 2 days a week. So the cost of running those programs for 2 days a week obviously comes down to how much you pay your coaches and how much it costs you to run tournaments and so on and so forth. But I would imagine the cost of something like that's probably about $1,500 if you're paying all of your coaches, which we did.
I want to get back to the origins of the company, because I think it's so neat how you started this up to work with homeless kids out of Brooklyn, a rugby, a sport these kids probably had never seen. But explain to me the success and the reach of Play Rugby USA. You started this program up, but at its peak, pre-pandemic, of course, what was the reach in kids and schools and so forth?
Yeah, the pre-pandemic, the core programs were in New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. They had served over 400 schools by that time, not at any one time, but over 400 schools. And I believe the busiest year we were in 150 schools just in that one year. It was about 5,000 kids participating in the programs, of which 1/3 were programs that we ran directly with our coaches paid in the schools or after school programs. And the other 2/3 were run by teachers or educators that worked in the after school programs, which we called our Train the Trainer program. So we mentored the teachers and then they worked with the kids. And that provided actually a bit more scale to those programs. And those programs were less expensive because we weren't paying our coaches, schools were paying the teachers, and that got more reach. And what that enabled us to do was then when we offered these tournaments, to have so many more kids come from so many more communities to be able to compete. So I think our biggest tournament in New York City, the biggest year we ever had one, was 74 teams. You might have even been at that one, actually, John.
I think we had our kids in Bermuda, which you helped me start up the program there. Came over to Bermuda and helped me write the curriculum for the program that became Beyond Rugby Bermuda.
Yeah, and you brought a bunch of all-star athletes over, and they just absolutely rocked it in New York City.
Our kids go into a Nike store there, and we got to Dr. J was there, an old basketball fan. That was Michael Jordan before Michael Jordan, for those that don't know. And I said, "Oh my goodness, Dr. J's here." And one of the kids said, "Do you think he has any headphones?" And I said, "If one of you kids call him Dr. Dre, you're going swimming back to Bermuda." That was before they were born. They didn't. So I made them all watch. I made them all watch YouTube and watch Dr. J to let them know who that guy was, and they were impressed at that point. What was the start? You started up 2003. What were you wanting to accomplish? I mean, certainly you didn't think, I'm gonna go to work at this full time. You're working with homeless kids in Brooklyn, introducing a sport they had never probably heard of before. What was that like that first weekend?
You hear this a lot, right, from people that just say that giving is such a powerful form of giving to yourself, especially if you're intending to serve other people, how it kind of comes back to you, like if you're a mentor. And that's exactly what that first weekend was like. I can't remember if it was a Saturday or Sunday, but I can remember exactly where we were, and I can remember seeing all the kids turn up and looking around at my volunteer coaches. It was basically just a couple of guys from the rugby club and a couple of guys from a bank. No one had been trained or anything like. And just thinking, oh my God, what have I done?
How'd you get the kids?
Through organizational contacts that we had been given by what was back then the New York City Sports Commission. And so they'd invited me along to talk at some event that they were running, because I was on the national team, and they asked me to talk at that, and I was chatting to them afterwards and saying, I've set this weekend program up and this is what I'm trying to do. And they said, oh, we'll introduce you to this homeless shelter in Brooklyn. And they introduced me to a police activities league up in the Bronx. And one organization now I just can't remember the name of, but they made those introductions, and I reached out and spoke to the people there, and everyone was just like, yeah, they had no idea what rugby was, right? It just didn't matter. There's somebody that was offering something that was very genuine. And I explained to them, it's just going to be really fun, boys and girls, they can all come along. It's a new sport, so it's a level playing field for everybody. So let's just bring them along and give them some fun and see what happens. And I just remember my first impression of seeing all the kids turn up, and I was sort of shocked because, you know, I hadn't really done any work in the homeless system before. And the kids literally just rocking up in whatever they had, right? So I'm thinking, you know, used to kids turning up in sports stuff for sports, but they kind of turn up in cat boots and trainers and jeans and shorts and hoodies and whatever it was that they were wearing is what they played in. And of course, so you obviously just get on with it. And I just remember we were running a bunch of fun games, and we ended actually playing a game of flag rugby at the end. And they absolutely loved it, and they really genuinely appreciated the fact that there was this group of random people that they never would have met before that were there purely to try and facilitate fun for them. No behaviour issues whatsoever. Everybody just had an absolute blast. All of the staff that came with them sat and watched, and some got up and joined in, and just was super grateful. And so that's how I felt at the end of it. And that's when I knew that we needed to be able to provide this on a regular basis. And that was the beginning of the weekend programs, where that organisation and the Police Activities League brought the kids to us for a couple of years prior to me getting out of the banking, because some weekends we'd serve 25 of them, some weekends we'd serve 75, and we wouldn't know until the day how many we were going to have, because we just didn't know who was going to show up.
Who did you play? Did you just play each other? I mean, was it just scrimmage games?
Yeah, it was scrimmage. Yeah, exactly. So every session, I think we had the field for a total of 2 hours, but we ran programming, if you like, probably for about an hour and a half in that time with lots of breaks. And so we just played a bunch of different games. We split the field into two. We had the younger kids on one side, which I think at the time was just like under 10s on one side and over 10s on the other. And the oldest kids were 14. So these aren't best practices, right? You don't generally have a 10-year-old running around with a 14-year-old, but it's what we did. We didn't have a lot of space, and so we needed to make it work. So we had the young kids on one side, the old kids on the other. All groups went through a series of fun games pretty much at the same time. We just progressed them differently to challenge the groups slightly differently. And then we split all the kids up into little teams in their age groups at the end. And all of them got to play a couple of like 10-minute little scrimmage games. And that was enough, because they weren't competing for anything. There wasn't any other teams to play against. These were the only kids playing rugby in New York City, outside of the older kids at Xavier High School at the time, which is a Catholic school that had a rugby program. That was it. So there wasn't anyone to play against anyway. So they played against themselves, and they had a blast.
When did you first realize that this could be something big? How long did that progression take, and what was that progression?
I'll give you an on-field and an off-field example. The on-field example was in 2006, the fall of 2006. So I'd just been out of banking for 6 months. We'd got a few programs into a few schools, and we ran our first tournament where the kids actually did get to play against each other from different schools. And it might have only been 3 or 4 schools that came, and we had a 6-team tournament on the rooftop at Pier 40 on the West Side Highway there in New York City. And that's when I knew this was going to work for sure, because there was no stopping those kids once they had played and represented their school. I mean, this was, to them, it was like the World Cup. You know, like they're in an after-school program, which tends to be recreational. It doesn't tend to have a team component and a competition component. And for us, the competition component was always the icing on the cake. It was the culmination of the whole season, and the way we ran our competitions reinforced all of the values and behaviors. And so they were incredibly powerful experiences. And so for those kids who literally came from one end of Brooklyn from the other end of the Bronx down to Pier 40 in Manhattan, that was a big deal for them to get on the train as a team, to go to this place that they hadn't been to before, play against kids from Brooklyn when they're from the Bronx and vice versa. Like, that doesn't happen at this age, right? And these kids weren't on really other teams. So it was a big deal. And we could just see from coaching / refereeing that this tournament, when I was chatting to my coaches afterwards, were like, wow, we could run more tournaments, you know? And so that's when I knew on the field. And I suppose off the field, it was reinforced when we got that first grant, because that, to me, as much as the funding, was the fact that we had enough credibility and enough ability to actually write a big grant that was, at the time, nearly as big as our organizational budget, and win it. And then that was the motivation to make sure we did a buttoned up job and deliver on all the outcomes for that grant, which we did. So that was the off-field moment that really changed the game, doubled the organization in size, and enabled us to work in one school with a big group of kids 5 days a week for multiple years. And you can imagine, you know, the impact you can have when you do that.
One of the hardest things in charities when I talk to people is, and I ask them, how do you measure success? And a lot of them have no idea. You know, they'll tell you some anecdotal stories, which are terrific. And these are great people doing great work, but they have a hard time quantifying what their success is beyond, we had a young man who was whatever, and he ended up going to college, and we saved this kid, which they did. But it's hard to measure that success. You've done a terrific job on metrics. You pioneered with algorithm, social and emotional learning, software that could measure the intangibles. Tell me about that software, and tell me about how you measure success, because so many charities, when they go to big donors, don't have that ability to quantify how their success is.
Yeah, so two parts to the answer. The first part is that before we had a metric system that we could align to, we were trying to do it ourselves. And I think that and this will probably be the same for a lot of people when they're starting out. And the rule on that is, you can only prove what you can prove, right? So you could prove short-term outcomes. You can prove from working with this young person for 10 weeks, these are the things you can actually see that we've been able to measure, whether it's through a survey or through data like attendance records, etc. You then have to tie that to this bigger, longer term impact that tends to be the stuff that gets funded. And it's really hard to do that. And so we tried to do that for a number of years. We created our own surveys and did all these things. And of course, it created some data and some insights and ability to really try and improve the program, which is the number one reason you do metrics anyways, to learn and improve. But one of the other reasons you do metrics is for funding. And so once we've been running those grant programs, we were introduced to the organization algorithm. We have a program called Hello Insights. We were introduced to them through an organization called You Think, who is an intermediary charity for all sorts of youth development charities across New York City. So they do a brilliant job of connecting programs like ours to resources that we may have not have heard of. And what we did with Hello Insights was took what they had was a social emotional learning measurement system, essentially, that was became validated because a number of young people had been through it. And it measured things like social capital, so having a connecting to something bigger than yourself. It measured social confidence and self-confidence, academic self-efficacy, number of different things that were about 6 outcomes that they measured. And we sat down with them and said, look, we love these 6 outcomes, but we actually think there's some other things we're doing with sports that aren't being captured here, because most of the programs were mentoring programs and tutoring programs and college shoot programs. There were some arts programs. And we said, we think we need to create one with youth specifically for sports. So we took their core model and worked with them over actually almost probably an 18-month period, testing out different things. And we're able to prove from the programming and research that they'd done that there was another 3 kind of things that sports were achieving, one of which was goal setting, right? Which is pretty huge in sports, because you can do goals at the beginning of a session, goals at the end of the session. So the long and short of it is that was a very, very powerful system. It's still operating. It's still, I think I might get the numbers wrong actually, but they've had 40 or 50,000 kids going through it just for sports. let alone the ones that have been through all our other modules. And what that enables now is if you're starting out a program from scratch, don't try and do what we did, which is measure your own staff. If you're in sports-based youth development, you're in the business of improving young people's behaviours, improving their values and opportunities and their connections and their ability to react based upon what they see and who they're with to make the best decisions they can for themselves. And that's what this system does. And social emotional learning is something that is recognised in the school system. It's something that schools are spending more time on. And it's all of those values that essentially show that by participating in this program, this young person has gone from here to here. And in aggregate, our young people have gone from here to here. And it's because it's validated, it's a very powerful tool. So anyone from any type of program can work with those guys over at Hello Insights and essentially ensure that what they're delivering is designed very intentionally to create a number of experiences that enable these young people to develop these skills, these social emotional learning skills. And they help with all of that design, the logic models, the theories of change, and all the things you need to kind of design your program so that you can best deliver it and measure how you're doing to improve it.
When I started up the charity in Bermuda, Nick Keller, who's a good friend of mine and yours, Beyond Sport founder, told me, he says, you got to get Mark Griffith to come over. So a cold call, you came over along with Rob Castaneda from Beyond the Ball in Chicago, works between the Latin Kings and 2-6 Nation, James Baderman, Fight for Peace in Rio. You guys came over and for almost a week helped me write curriculum for these kids. It was like you guys were speaking Greek. I had no idea the intricacies and the way that analytics of you guys putting together this charity for me that ended up being very successful because of a lot of great people in Bermuda that rallied around the cause. But what would you tell a 2003 Mark Griffith, or what would you tell somebody out there right now that's starting up a charity after all you've been through and what you've learned?
What a great question. What would I tell myself? I would tell myself, I'm going to use play rugby terminology, stick with it and go forward, because you believe in it and you're going to prove it, but it's going to be really hard work and very, very stressful. And it was a lot more stressful than I probably would have anticipated, because at the beginning, you're just so driven by the vision and wanting to prove that you can have that impact. And ultimately, that's the thing to hold on to. So that's the message I would give to everybody. But the other message I would give is that there's so many more tools now, and that sports-based youth development now is so much more elevated as a sector and recognised as a vehicle, a really powerful vehicle for young people when programs are delivered intentionally to develop those connections and to build those positive cultures that the young people need to thrive. And so use the other resources that are out there, and don't try and recreate the wheel on your own measurement system. Work with people like Hello Insights and ensure that early on in your program design you put those things in. But yeah, don't lose the magic of the belief, because from whatever reason, from your experiences, you know it's going to work, and that as long as you're always confident in that, you're not going to go too far wrong.
I've been blessed to be able to visit a lot of charities around the world, from India and Africa to Europe, and a lot in North America. People ask me the commonality of successful charities, and it's not necessarily a curriculum, it's personalities. It's very, very personality driven. You know, when you have Michael Jordan, you don't really matter what kind of offense you run, you're going to score a lot of freaking points. And Play Rugby USA was Mark Griffin. It's intertwined. You left Play Rugby USA, and the hardest thing in charity is when you have this charismatic founder who is everything to that charity, to be able to establish that charity where they can leave it and it still have success. You got an NBE from the Queen. You've been recognized by everybody as running this wonderful charity. 60% of your coaches are your alumni that have come through the program. How do you set in place the system that this charity outlives you?
Yeah, that is a really good question. The story on that is, it was February 3rd or something, February 1st, 2016, and I had a board meeting, and I gave my board 3 years notice.
3 years.
You know, like
that's ample time, by the way. That 3 years is like ample time.
Not 3 days, not 3 weeks, not 3 months. So I said at the end of 2018, guys, I will be leaving Play Rugby. You need me to leave. I need to leave. I want to leave things in the right place. At some point, we're going to need a transition plan and a succession plan. So not right now, but just get it in the minutes that's going to happen. And so I think the first most important point for anyone that wants to leave something and move on, but enable it to continue beyond them, is to make that decision and put a line in the sand. Because one of the hardest things running a program like this, you know, where you said it's about the people, and it's about the people and the purpose. It's those two things really that drive it. That if you're so motivated to continue to do that and to have that impact, it's really hard to actually say, okay, I'm going to leave at this date. I'm going to leave at this date. And if you don't plan it, it's really hard to set up the systems you need to go beyond you, right? So I think there's various different pieces, just like there is in any organization, that you need to look at. You need to look at the program efficacy, like how good is the program actually doing in terms of delivering its outcomes, and to what extent is it scaled and is it overscaled? So are you focused on the right things from a program perspective? Is the program the right size, and have you got the right people? That's the most critical core nuts and bolts of that organization. So you want to leave that in a really, really good place. Then there's the financial capacity of the organization, which is probably the biggest challenge in any charity. So what does that look like? That was not in a good place for the last few years at Play Rugby. We were operating month to month. So I'm a good person to ask how not to do it, not necessarily the person that did it right, but we got there. And then to what extent have you got different processes and systems, and even down to things like culture and stuff that are documented and are understood and are practiced on a regular basis? And I think we had quite a lot of that stuff from a programming perspective in good shape, but not necessarily more broadly around the organization, because what tended to happen in our instance was I would just fill in gaps and take on things, and therefore not really create systems in place for other people to do some of those things. I just did them. So when I was looking to hand this thing over, that wasn't going to work. So the hardest thing I had to do was the last 6 months of the organization, while we were looking for somebody to potentially replace me, was to basically make things more manageable. And that for us meant we had to actually cut back on some programs because we'd spread too broadly and too thin. We had to cut back on some people, really good people, passionate people, but we just genuinely couldn't afford them. And the only reason we had was just because I kept scrambling around to try to pull things together to keep people there. That wasn't sustainable. So we had to pull back on some people. We had to pull back on some programs. We had to skinny down the financial fixed cost to try to create artificially some more capacity for somebody to take it on. And then, of course, the absolute critical linchpin of this whole thing is you've got to find the right replacement. And we were super lucky that we found Will Snape Rogers, who just happened to be looking. He was actually the last person to apply for the role. We had a couple of fantastic candidates kind of shortlisted, and he reached out to me and said, look, I'd love to do this, but what do you think? And I said, I think if you want to do it, you better put your application in like tomorrow, because we're nearly there. And he went through the process, and he just had the right balance of skills of, kind of, if you like, the passion for rugby, because he'd been a professional rugby player and a very high level coach, professional business experience that he'd come from the commercial environment after his professional rugby career ended, and then was in a small rugby organization looking to try and scale programs. So he had a really unique combination of skills that were going to be required. The only thing he didn't have was non-profit experience, and that's a pretty big red flag. But he's an intelligent guy, and obviously ended up to pick up a lot of the nuances of running a non-profit, which at the end of the day, it's stakeholder engagement, and it's like any other business. Even though you're not there to drive a profit, you still need a profit to be able to grow the organization wherever that funding comes from, and you need to do it in the same way as any other organization. So yeah, he's taken it, taken it on and done an incredible job, doing an incredibly challenging time. And they're actually in a very good place to grow once things open up again.
Well, let me read to you what Will Snape Rogers sent to me this morning. This is from Will. Mark is an incredibly passionate, dedicated, and inspiring guy. Never stops thinking about and working on how he can improve the lives of people he meets, and specifically people who've had restricted opportunities. I meet new people every week whose lives literally changed because of the work Mark has done. Without Mark and Play Rugby, fewer young people would have the tools to access own potential, make positive life choices, and have the skills to seize opportunities for future success. Will Snape Rogers. That's what your predecessor, your successor, said about you this morning when I asked him for some information on Play Rugby and gosh,
wow.
can you give me a quote? And he got it to me within minutes.
Oh wow! Well, there you go. I mean, that's the kind of guy he is, and he's super humble, really, because he's had to take the organisation through undoubtedly its biggest challenge, right? The COVID for any organisation, and every organisation's had their own challenges and opportunities that have come from it. But when you are a non-profit, first and foremost, so you probably don't have the financial capacity, and that's not fair on all non-profits, some really do. But if you're a non-profit that doesn't have much financial capacity, you're a non-profit that is operating in a system that gets shut down overnight, and that drives a lot of your revenue. What do you do? And he just did a fantastic job making some also very, very tough decisions. But it's enabled the organisation to come through into 2021 in a place where it has now an opportunity to grow based on where the opportunities are, and to really now focus on absolutely what they want to do. The vision doesn't change, the purpose doesn't change. All of that stuff is going to stay the same for Play Rugby, but how they get there now, they really have they've created now the opportunity to drive that exactly how they want to drive it, because everything essentially got pared right back, and so they can grow just in the areas where they know they can have the most impact. And that's actually really exciting, as painful as it's been for everybody.
Let me read you one more quote. This is from Martin Pengelly, the writer of The Guardian. Terrific writer. I'm so happy he didn't put a bunch of big words in here that I wouldn't be able to pronounce, because Martin's a very cerebral guy. I first met Mark in 1996 when I was a quivering fresher second row, and he was Durham University's first team hooker, packing down next to David Barnes, later of Harlequins in Bath, and using me and my ilk as tackle bag holders, scrummaging opposition, and general cannon fodder in training twice a week. I was in awe of his talent and drive in. So when years later we reconnected in New York, I wasn't really surprised he'd won caps for the Eagles and started Play Rugby USA. Not just started, but grown, driven, and made thrive for so many years. When Mark decides to do something, clear an 18-year-old lot from a training ground ruck or improve the lives of thousands of kids from inner city New York, it stays done. Reporting on Mark was as much an education as trying to survive opposite him on the field. For Martin Pengelly. Mark, you've changed thousands and thousands of lives in inner cities, and your program has influenced programs like mine in Bermuda that's changed hundreds of lives. What are you doing now? Because guys like you don't retire. Guys like you find the next adventure. What are you doing now?
Yeah, so it's for the first time in 16 years, starting in April, I will not be working full-time in rugby, which is, I don't know that that's sunk in yet, but it is what it is. And it's really actually quite exciting, because I've founded an organization called Purpose Fused. And so while I'm not going to be working rugby, I'm still 100% following my passion and my purpose. And my purpose is all about unlocking people's potential. And obviously Play Rugby was an incredible journey and an opportunity to do that with some other amazing, passionate people that just cared first and foremost about giving young people the opportunities that they deserved. And so I'm just now taking that same drive that I have, which is trying to help people be the best version of themselves, and taking it to organizations, and using purpose as the vehicle to unlock people's potential instead of rugby. So it'll be a little less physically active, but it'll be just as energetic and just as fun and just as challenging, working with adults. And the end game of that is that organizations can be the best version of themselves because they're taking care of their people, to drive whatever performance metrics they want to drive and to ensure they deliver meaningful social impact. And so one of the outcomes from the organization that I'm going to be starting very, very soon here is to demonstrate some impact on society and try to connect some of the dots between organizations like Play Rugby USA and corporations where together they might be able to achieve certain things where, 1 + 1 can equal 3, and really, really inspire people to be the best version of themselves because they can see the impact that they're having. So Purpose Fused is the new adventure. It's going to be in the US and the UK, and then philanthropically, Purpose Fused will have a give back piece to it directly. But I'm also on the board of, funnily enough, an organisation called Defy DFY in London, which is the sister program or the mirror program of Play Rugby USA. We ran some programming back in London for a couple of years, now nearly 9 years ago. And there's a great organisation over there that has taken that on, that represent athletes, and they have some brilliant ambassadors, and they're going to get them involved in this program. And essentially, I think they've even got a call with Will this week or next week to talk about some programming that's starting in April. And so I'll just be on the board of trustees there and just helping hopefully guide some things forward there to create some opportunities in London. And what I would like to see is some transatlantic connection and opportunities for these young people to hopefully go back and forth over time, compete against each other, develop some virtual relationships, and maybe deliver some programming and other things together, and just sort of change the perceptions of what opportunity means to them. Because there's kids in New York City doing the same thing that they're doing, and they're from similar backgrounds, but never would have met if it wasn't for this program. So hopefully Play Rugby USA and Defy will be able to do some work together over time, and it'll be really awesome to be on the seat of the board on the other side of the pond, and just having informal chats with Will on this side of the pond and see how it all goes.
So what are the odds that in 1 year you're coaching a rugby team part-time on the weekend?
1 year, yeah, really good. Honestly, I literally almost wrote this stuff down the other day. I was like, okay, so I'm not working in rugby. What does that really mean? And for me, trying to look at it positively, is I actually am going to be able to enjoy rugby in a different way now, because rather than it being my job, my career, and what I need to do Monday to Friday and at the weekends, depending on what's going on, rugby can now be, I can go out coaching and get my little lad Hudson, who's 19 months, so a year, perfect, right? We'll get the little Rugger Tots program going. I'll be coaching that in our local community, for sure. I think that's going to happen. I'm going to be able to go to rugby matches as a fan, and just enjoy the experience. I might do some commentating and stuff that all these things I wouldn't have had time to do, because I was working full-time in rugby. I think I'll be able to do now truly as a kind of a passion project and a hobby on the side. And that'll be really enriching, and I'm actually really excited about it.
Well, Mark, you've inspired me since the first day I met you. You came over to Bermuda, didn't charge anything, came over and helped start up a program there. A lot of people know about your story, so this is not like I've shared the story for the first time, but I'm honored to be able to share the story on this platform. Mark, thank you very much, and your life of people changing the world.
John, thanks so much for having me and always being such an advocate for us, Play Rugby and programs like this. We really, really appreciate it. Thanks for giving us a platform.